Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending our parent information training. I am Tristan Moore. I'm the program coordinator for the care team here at Heartspring. And this morning we have Megan Swett, who is our division director of the school, and she's going to present on IEP Advocacy.
All right. Hi, guys. So like Tristan said, my current role is with the Heartspring School. However, I'm going to start this training a little about me. So I currently work at Heartspring, but I do have some background in a public school. So I was a school psychologist in a local public school for almost 7 years. And so some of my training tips and tricks and advice from this training will be from my experience there. Some of it will be from my experience here. So just a little bit of background. So I am a school psychologist and also a board certified behavior analyst. I've worked in special education for 18 years, both in the public and residential settings. My main goal today for this training is to help you navigate the special education system. If you don't know already, it can be quite difficult. And here's why: it can be overwhelming. There's so many different parts and components and qualifications and boxes that have to be checked. And there's just so many things that it can become overwhelming. Why is this going to be helpful? Because just like special education, the law is confusing. So it's confusing to parents, educators, and even attorneys. But the law is so important because it guides our practice as practitioners, as teachers, as administrators. What does the law say about evaluations and reevaluation? So if you have a child who has already been identified, then you're going to want to know what the school district is required to do, what would be helpful for you to be able to give input as a parent. You're going to need to know, what the testing might look like for initial evaluations, how long the school district has to do that, not just to make sure that they're doing what they're doing or what they're supposed to be doing, but it's also helpful for you, as we'll talk about later. Parent input is like critical to the special education process and even the general education process for any child. What does the law say about IEPs? So if you have a child who has qualified for special education, which I'll talk about later, then you need to know what is an individualized education program? What are the components? What are some examples of what that might look like? IEP goals, objectives. I'll go over all this in the training. What does the law say about inclusion? So in relation to the least restrictive environment, and again, I'll go over that. But where does your child need to be to receive the best education that they can? Is it in a special education classroom? Is it in a general education classroom? So these are things that you need to know what your options are. So when the team is talking about this, you have input because your input's vital. Behavior. What does the law say about positive behavioral intervention plans? I know that Missy talked a little bit on a previous training about general education, and I'm assuming she touched a little bit on behavior, being a board certified behavior analyst. What does the law say about parent notice? So what information is the school district going to provide to you and when? And that's helpful so you know what questions to ask if you have questions. Independent educational evaluations, which I'll talk about, mediation, due process. So what happens if there's difficulties, right? And you've tried everything. What are your options? What are things you can do as a parent? Knowledge is power. So I loved this, included this. So again, this goes back to my goal today. Depending on where you are in the process, information is going to be very important to you. If you know ahead of time what's required, then you know that knowledge behind it. And so the time that you spend with teachers and teams, you can be using that time to make a plan or program or interventions specific to your child because you already know the process or have a background information about that. I've come to learn that there's no better gauge for your child's education than the experience in the IEP meeting. So that's one thing I'm going to focus on too, is what are some tips and tricks that you can do to make sure that any meeting that you have with the school is beneficial and you feel good about it and you're able to advocate for your child at the same time working with the other people who are required to provide an education for your child. So my goals is to provide relevant information in the easiest way to understand. Going back to the law is confusing. So is the process. So what I wanted to do is try to break that down as specific as possible to give you more of that background information as to special education law and procedures. I want to empower you as a parent to share the responsibility for developing the education plan. You're a vital part of that, of your child's team. So I want to empower you as a parent to feel confident and comfortable to be able to develop that plan alongside the rest of the team, help you to understand the special education process, demonstrate how all students benefit from involvement of the parent in the education process. And it's not just at special education, that goes back to general education too, because that's where we start with this. So if you get to special education, you had to start with general education. So how can we be as involved as possible before we get to this point? An active role requires parents to have information about the process and requirements. And that's one of my goals to do today is to share that information with you. And then to review your rights as parents of students with or without identified disability. So in going through and putting this training together, I first started with, the title, how can I help you advocate for your child? And I kind of started my brainstorming process with, well, maybe I should share all the specific situations where other parents have had to advocate for their child, or, like these are things that other parents have had to experience. But I really wanted to, as I kept thinking, go back to the basics. So knowledge is power. And I think oftentimes it's confusing. People don't feel comfortable asking questions. And they don't have that prior knowledge or that background information. So that's where I wanted to start with this. And these are the goals for this presentation. So special education law, you can't talk about special education without talking about special education law. So some primary laws is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004, or IDEA. If you're involved in special education with your child already, you know that there's a lot of acronyms. Section 504, No Child Left Behind, Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, and then state laws and regulations. The other thing that I really focused on with this training is, what does Kansas say? So you have like kind of two folds. You have your federal laws that every state is required to abide by and to make sure that they incorporate. But you also have your state laws and regulations. And I think that in my experience working, in a public school, I think that that's probably where most parents have, limited knowledge or information about, and that's, nothing against the parent. I mean, this is so complicated, but I want to make sure that I did my due diligence to make sure that I tried to change that, or make sure that you have those basics, the building blocks. So that'll help you in this process. History of special education. So special education has been evolving since it started, which is really good because, obviously times change, generations change, we have to stay up with those. So starting with today, so today all children with disabilities have rights, which that always wasn't the case. Students with disabilities are able to have modifications and accommodations to make sure that they are getting the best education possible, because we all know, whether you're an educator or a parent, practitioner, education is so vital and important. And why? are we where we are? Because of advocacy groups, parents, school leaders that have pushed the state and federal laws to get where they are today, public pressure. And don't get me wrong, like we've evolved, we've gotten to a better place with education and special education in particular, but there's so much further that we can go. So the advocacy doesn't stop now, like it continues. And so that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do this training for you guys as parents. So early on, most students with disabilities didn't attend school. And if they did attend school later, it was in isolation. They were by themselves. There were no peers. They were in institutions. But thankfully, due to federal laws and regulations like the ones we talked about, No Child Left Behind, IDEA, we've gotten to the point where there is an inclusion movement and has been for a while. So your child's not in a room all by themselves unless they need to be for their individualized needs. Our goal and every goal would be to keep them in the general education classroom curriculum as long as possible. But that's not always possible. So that's why we're going to talk about special education today. Common misconception, and I know this is helpful. Hopefully this is helpful for you guys. It was helpful for me in graduate school. They really emphasized that special education is not a place. It's not a room. It's not a place where a person goes or is put, right? So special education are accommodations, it's modifications, it's goals, monitoring progress a different way than you would a typical student or a student that's not identified as a special education student. It takes team collaboration. So it's one thing we're going to talk about today. It takes consultation from specialists, related service providers. So what that means is, you know, your child might need speech and language therapy. They might need occupational therapy, physical therapy, related services, physical assistance, behavior support plans, crisis intervention plans, environmental modifications. So the teacher might need to change up a little bit what they're doing. They might need to change the environment. These are all the things that make special education what it is. It's not a place. So if anyone tries to tell you different, it's not right. It's not true. Okay, so being a behavior analyst, and even as a school psychologist, we need to use data. We need to make data-based decisions. And the federal law says that, state regulations and rules say that. So this is individualized. And in order to see the need, to see the eligibility, to see the progress, we have to have data. So one of my things for you is show me the data. Data could be data, like it's going to be individualized to your child, but we should not be making any decisions without data. So education always starts with general education, right? So research-based interventions should start before you get to special education. This is going to show how your child responds to the general classroom. So just your normal third grade, your normal fourth grade, with the instruction that the teacher is currently providing. General education curriculum, an evaluation team needs to understand how the child is progressing in the general education curriculum across settings with the available supports. So some general education classrooms have, paraeducators for general education students and special education students. So on this process, you might have heard of the MTSS process, or the multi-tiered systems of support. That's where this is going to come into play. So if a teacher identifies that maybe your student or your child needs a little bit more extra help in a particular subject, then they're able to work on those deficits or weaknesses or difficulties ahead of time. So if we've tried those things and they're not working, and we've kind of tweaked them, or we've tried to change them, and then that's not working, then we would be able to further progress to make sure that your child's getting what they need to be able to be educated to the best possibility for their need. So what is special education? Again, not a place. Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, federal law, that ensures that your child is able to access a free and appropriate public education. Ensures that students with disabilities are provided education based on their individual needs. And it's designed to ensure all students are allowed access to the public school with no regards to disability. So again, the advocacy and where we are today is because of some of these laws and regulations, this one in particular. What is a free appropriate public education? So what that means is students ages 3 to 21 have the right to attend public school without cost to parent. Students are provided a individualized education plan if they are in special education. It is mandated for students in preschool, elementary, secondary, and also to those who are suspended. So if you have, if your child is identified as special education, there's a particular process that has to happen to be able to make sure that they're still able to receive those services. Students are provided an appropriate education in the public school in the least restrictive environment. So again, going back to, we want as much involvement with typical peers as possible for any child that's identified in special education. IDA 2004 has specific categories where a child can fall within to be eligible for special education. So what this is dependent upon is a particular disability. So there are 13 disability categories, and I have listed all of these. We do have some that might include more than one disability. So we have multiple disability. So that's for those students who have a pretty significant impairment that might not be just due to one category. We have other health impairment. So again, that is some of the other categories that aren't specific to the other ones identified. So we have specific learning disabilities, speech or language impairment. So you might have a student with autism that also has a speech and language impairment. So they might meet 2 eligibility criteria. But these are the categories. So if you already have a student or a child who is identified, then you would have been told how they qualified, what was their disability category as far as the state law and regulations to be able to receive special education services. And that's one thing that that's very specific, that you as a parent need to know that. So that's something that you would know, or that you would be told by the school when they complete the evaluation. So here is the process for determining eligibility. And I have this multiple places within this training, just because I think that it's helpful for the different stages. So first of all, you start with a student or a child, right? It's individualized. First thing, special education referral. So what this can look like is it could be from a teacher. So if, a teacher has a 3rd grade student where they're concerned that they're not meeting benchmarks as far as like state assessments or district-wide assessments, or, they're really struggling in a particular subject, math, reading, etc. A teacher could identify that need and then refer that child for a special education referral. And then you as parents, so again, let's go with 3rd grade, and I'm just pulling that. But so your child gets to 3rd grade, you've either had those general education interventions for your child. So you've been told they're getting this specific intervention, here's the progress, and you as a parent just really don't feel comfortable with either what they're being provided or the progress they're making. Then you can make a referral for special education. So any referral would be responded to by the school if it's a parent request, and a parent if it was a school request. And then an evaluation is going to occur. And then we have to determine the eligibility. So in order to do that, which I'll talk a little bit more about, the evaluation. So they're going to use a variety of tools, multiple sources of data. Here's where I kind of want to get on my soapbox. One of the most important data points for this evaluation is parent input. And, you know, not to be negative, we're all busy, but working in a regular education school, that was the thing that I probably had the most difficulty getting back, was like data from parents. But it's really important that we have your input so we can compare school and home, which I have a what I think is a funny picture later to kind of illustrate why that's important. But multiple sources of data, school data, home data, different types of data. And then we determine by the group of professionals or the team, including teachers and parents, do they have a disability that qualifies for special education? And do they need special education, which I'll get to more specifically. So I kind of liked this flow chart. And I'm going to stop with where I am there because I have it later and it'll make more sense when I talk about the evaluation and eligibility process. Okay, here's my other plug. Keep calm and show me the data. So again, that evaluation, we're going to look at that data from multiple sources to see where your child is with what they're receiving. So again, if you're not seeing data, ask for the data because we have to make data-based decisions. So the data that you might ask for is state assessments, district level assessments, which you're going to probably already have those because they send those out. Specific progress, you know, ask for those general education interventions, ask for the progress if you haven't received that. If a teacher is making a request, just ask, you know, what data they're using. And all of this can be done. This is just information seeking. So I kind of like, there's two types of questions. There's challenging and there's information seeking. There's nothing wrong. Well, there's nothing wrong with either, but in this process, there's nothing wrong about asking for more information. There's not. I think that unfortunately, that's where we get into trouble or we have difficulty with teamwork and working as teams on both sides, is because our communication's not clear or it wasn't understood, which goes back to this is confusing. So again, my plug, show me the data. Okay, so the initial evaluation. So you've either asked for an evaluation or the school district or teacher, the teacher has requested an evaluation for your child. So it should be comprehensive, right? So we should be looking at academic performance. Where are they in reading, math, written language, all of those core subjects? Communication. So are they able to communicate to get their needs met? Is the academic performance impacted by communication? And without knowing the data, we don't know. General intelligence. So more than likely, the school psychologist is going to do intelligence testing to be able to see kind of where the strengths and weaknesses of your child is or are, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Hearing and vision and health. So as a school psychologist in a public school, another hard thing that I did or had to do is test students that didn't have their glasses. And I get it. I have a 5-year-old. I get it. But that's so critical. So in order to do the testing, we have to make sure that we have a past vision and hearing screening, because if we don't have that, then the results probably aren't going to be reliable or valid, right? Because we can't say they weren't able to hear parts of the test. They weren't able to see things that they had to see to be able to complete the test. So the school district will make sure that they have a past and a recent hearing and vision. But your child also, if they wear glasses, they need glasses for testing that day or contacts, whatever it might be. Motor abilities, so their physical motor abilities, social, emotional behavior. Those are all areas that will likely be assessed during the initial evaluation, and you will be given data to show how they were assessed, what data that they showed, and then have conversations based on that data. Timeline. Okay, so here's where this gets kind of confusing. I think it's even confusing for districts and teachers and special education teachers as well as parents. But there's a 60-day timeline, and that's consistent with federal regulations. That's not just a Kansas thing. Kansas obviously requires us to do that, but that's a federal regulation. So that 60 school day, not calendar day, school days, starts upon the receipt of the written parent consent to conduct the evaluation. The evaluation cannot take place without your consent. It ends with the implementation of the IEP if the child is found eligible. So all of that has to happen for a school district to meet the federal and state regulations within a 60-day timeline. Okay, so that goes back to the sensitivity of the parent input. Because if the school psychologist doesn't get the assessments they ask you to complete or your input, then it's hard to look at the school input and the parent input at the same time, which can delay that 60-day timeline, which is important because if your child's struggling, I know that you want to get them the quick services that they need as soon as possible. For children who transfer from one public agency to another in the same school year, so that's, for example, local. If you live in Mulvane and then you move to Derby, assessments are coordinated with the child's prior school as necessary. So if a teacher requested an evaluation and you gave consent, but then you moved, that evaluation would continue. So the school district would take whatever was done and then finish that evaluation. Ensure prompt completion of the evaluation has begun prior to the school year. All right, initial evaluation timeline. I'm not going to go over all of this, but what I wanted to include, this is straight from KSDE, or the Kansas State Department of Education. So I talked about earlier, I want to make sure that you know what our state requires, or Kansas if you're from out of state. So it talks about the 60-day timeline. It talks about the initial evaluation is started within a reasonable time. So, for example, you give consent for an evaluation. If the evaluation is started 55 school days into that 60-day timeline, that's probably not reasonable, right? They're not going to be able to give you a good evaluation, or they're not going to be able to evaluate your child in the best way possible. So state requires it that it's reasonable, which is kind of, I mean, that's relative because reasonable to me might not be reasonable to you. But I hope my example helped. The initial evaluation is completed based on the data. So again, that's my plug, right? We need the data. We need that general education data. We need the evaluation data. That data is critical. We cannot make eligibility indication without the data. They're going to provide you an evaluation or eligibility report. So what that includes is all of the testing, observations, any data that they considered for the eligibility, right? As a school psychologist in a public school, that data and that report could be pretty lengthy. Because I know myself in particular, I wanted to make sure that I was giving the best evaluation that I could, the most data that I could, to get the best baseline possible. Because the baseline, or where that child is at that time, is so important to see that progress. So what I used to tell parents is, I know it's a lot of information, and my eligibility meetings probably ran a little bit longer than what people would prefer, but I wanted to make sure that you felt informed. You felt like you had all the information. If you go home, and this is what I always told my families and parents, if you go home and you have questions, reach out, right? No one expects you as a parent to understand and process all of that information at one time, because it is so much, right? You're going to get a prior written notice for the proposed identification. So it's going to say, we met on August 22nd, 2021. At this point, Sally was found eligible for special education services due to her eligibility in autism, whatever that might be. So you have to get informed or written notice, meaning at least 10 thing that if for some reason there's something happens, then you can give the district or the school district permission to go ahead and conduct the meeting. Say they gave you 7 days notice, but that's up to you. But that is part of that, dependent on, circumstances of the evaluation or the child. Because sometimes you do have, a child that gets sick, or, something happens, a death in the family. There are individual circumstances that do impact the 60-day timeline, or just the way that the meetings are held. So, the school district reaches out to you and says, hey, I want to schedule the evaluation results or the IEP, whatever it might be. They give you, they give you in 11 days, 13 days, 15 days, but that doesn't work for you. You can only do it within 7 days. So that's kind of where that works both ways and can be accommodating. The IEP team meets and develops an IEP within 30 calendar days of determination of eligibility. So that varies by the student. Oftentimes what I found when I practiced in a public school is we had the IEP draft for you, and then we were able to get and work on the IEP together after the eligibility. Some parents preferred that rather than having 2 meetings. Sometimes that wasn't possible on both ends. The school district wasn't able to have 2 meetings back to back for the eligibility and the IEP, or parents weren't. And so there is some individualization to that. Services on the IEP are implemented no later than 10 days after you say that the child can receive special education services. And then the 60 days timeline ends when the IEP is implemented. So again, this comes straight from Kansas State Department of Education. So I put this in here so you could have this to refer to if you had any questions throughout the process. All right, timeline. We talked about that. All right, the evaluation process. So we talked about multiple tools, parent input, testing, observations. That must lead to the determination of where your child is and where they need to be based on their age and grade level. If the child has an exceptionality, so that goes back to, do they qualify under autism? Do they qualify under other health impairment, whatever the eligibility might be? We need to determine the needs of the child, where they are academically, and then whether they need any accommodations or modifications to be able to be where they need to be. Again, show me the data, right? That evaluation is based on the data. Multiple sources. So this is something that I like and I've used in training and talking to parents too, is the school is going to review the records. So, if they're in 5th grade, what happened in 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, kind of looking up to where they are at that point. Interviews, they're going to talk to you as parents. They're going to talk to other teachers. They're going to talk to maybe the school counselor, whoever that person that has information about your child, to be able to provide that data. They're going to observe. So they're going to observe your child in their educational setting to see kind of, how your child specifically responds to the environment. Teachers can report that, but it's also difficult because, they have 20, 22 other kids in that classroom. So, and the school psychologist has different training and can see different things. So they're going to observe, and then they're going to test. The test depends on the student's difficulties. There's two methods of evaluation. So basically, the child's response to research-based interventions, so that goes back to that multi-tiered systems levels of support. So what support has already been provided to your child before they got to this point, or a patterns of strengths and weaknesses. So do they have particular, just math, for example, do they have particular strengths and weaknesses compared to the area that they're struggling with? So, are they struggling with both math and reading? Is that due to just needing more specific instruction? Or is it really like they're struggling with math because of this specific problem? So computation, or are they having difficulty reading applied problems because of reading? So basically just really separating out all of the difficulties that lead to the identified areas, and then all of the difficulties due to the subject or the core content where they're struggling. And then the evaluation team uses that strengths and weaknesses data to support if that's enough or if it's not enough and they need special education or an IEP. Most often the child's response to intervention data will take the form of charts and graphs. So again, when you ask for the data, the school district's going to be able to provide that data to you, and then that's going to look and be able to tell you where the child is growing in relation to the interventions. So going back to why those general education interventions are so important. So do two different methods of evaluation. You will know what type of evaluation method was used based on the eligibility report and the school psychologist conversation in that eligibility meeting. So there's two prongs. I would oftentimes run into people not understanding this. So I have a teacher that says, oh, well, they have a medical diagnosis of autism. I see all of these characteristics that I know are associated with autism. That's not enough. And there's a good reason why that's not enough. Because some students with disabilities can function in a general education classroom with just general education modifications and accommodations, right? Or they can have a Section 504 plan, which is not under special education. So they're not identified as a special education student, but they still receive those supports that they need. So all students receive the supports that they need for free, appropriate public education. Exclusionary criteria. So it kind of goes back to the glasses. So I'm not going to be able to say your child is eligible for special education because I didn't have reliable or valid data because they weren't wearing their glasses. So is it a vision problem? I don't know, because they didn't have the accommodations or modifications that's, to be able to show their best, to show me what they could do. Is the data congruent with indicators of the exceptionality? So that goes back to like that strengths and weaknesses. So are they struggling in those basic skills that they need to be able to do particular things? So my math example. So if they have a medical diagnosis of autism, is that data showing that they have difficulty in communication? Is that data showing that they have difficulty in social interactions? Is that data showing that they have difficulty in demonstrating age-appropriate behaviors, or are they exhibiting behaviors that may not be age-appropriate but might be due to the disability? So that's the eligibility side of the evaluation. Prong 2 is need. So again, you might have that child that all they need is that general education intervention. They don't show the need for special education. If a child or a student doesn't need special education, then they don't need it. We can provide the education outside of that. So federal and state require us as eligibility evaluations to make sure that we have both. So is there specific design instruction? Are we differentiating or making sure that we're giving your child what they need in the areas where they're struggling? Those exclusionary factors or exceptions, kind of like I talked about with the glasses, is lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math. So say the child had a specific illness that kept them out of school. So if they're not in school, then they probably didn't get that appropriate instruction in reading and math. So is it due to the disability, or is it due to the lack of instruction appropriate to be able to be where they should be? And then limited English proficiency. So that's a really, really important one. So is it because, English is their second language and they don't understand what's being taught to them? That's a whole separate issue that needs to be addressed before special education. And so the law requires us that if we think it's due to one of these, then we need to focus on that first before qualifying them. Student does not otherwise meet the eligibility criteria under the 13 eligibility indicators. They don't have one of those 13 areas to qualify for special education. So, and even with the disability definition satisfied, so that prong one, students must require special education in order to be found eligible. And I think that that's probably something that had to be communicated, or places where people struggled, even teachers. So I know that they have these characteristics, but do they actually need those services? And in order to know that, what are we going to look at? We're going to look at the data. So data is very important. Determine need for special education. So do they need more intense instruction? Do they need more intense interventions? And does the child's unique needs require them to need special education? Eligibility, then what? So going back to this flow chart. So we had the referral, we did the evaluation, we found that they were eligible. So on this left side, we found that the child has one of the 13 disabilities and needs special education. So we met prong one and prong two. The next step is to develop the IEP. So in order to develop the IEP, we look at the data for the evaluation. So you can't develop an IEP without the data from the evaluation. So that's why that data is really important. And in order to do that, we are going to have a student IEP team. What that consists of is the education teacher. So that's typically your regular education teacher, a case manager. Oftentimes, the case manager in a public school would be the special education teacher for either that age or grade level. Parent or guardian, very, very important. There's no student IEP team without a parent or a guardian. Student is appropriate. That usually happens later on when the child's able to understand and advocate and be able to tell the school district what they need. So that's typically in middle school or high school, depending on the circumstance. So that's individualized. Special education teacher. So sometimes that special education teacher might be the case manager. Clinicians. So did we evaluate because we saw a weakness or difficulty with motor? So that'd be physical therapy or occupational therapy, handwriting, BCBA. So is it due to behavior or lack of behavior? That might be a BCBA if you have one in your school district, a school counselor, a school psychologist, and a behavior coach. Every school district is different. So that's going to be dependent on your school district, and speech therapist if you had data to support that needed to be assessed. And then transition services as appropriate. So that depends on the student's age as well. Independent education evaluation, took this straight from Kansas State Department of Education. I think oftentimes you're going to get a good evaluation. You're going to have all the information that you need. But if you don't feel that way, you as a parent do have rights. So if the parent requests an independent educational evaluation, the school must provide information to the parent about where an independent education evaluation can be obtained, ensure that the evaluation is provided at public expense, unless a due process hearing officer determines that the evaluation did meet the criteria, and initiate a due process hearing to show the school's evaluation was appropriate. This will make a little bit more sense on the next slide. So oftentimes, conflict resolution can be handled at the IEP meeting. So if we we give you the data, if you are able to ask the questions that you need to ask, we make sure that we assess all the components. Most of the time, we can develop an IEP that meets everyone's needs. So it stops at that bottom level. We're able to communicate, build relationships, and we feel comfortable that the student or child, depending on if you're a teacher or a parent, receives the services that they need. If that's not the case, then there is a process for that. And then this is kind of the continuum. So it starts with mediation, a state complaint or state mediation, a due process hearing, and then a district court. So that's a resource for you. I want to go back to your input as the student IEP team member. Regardless of how empathetic, how well people listen, or how well you communicate, it's going to be difficult for the rest of the team members to truly understand your perspective or where you come from because they're not in your shoes. So I think that that's important for us as practitioners, us as, if we're in a public school, residential school, to understand that you guys are doing the best that you can. And we don't know the pressures and the advocating that you feel like you need to do for your child. So I just think that's important for everyone to remember. So I want to make sure that I hit on that. We're on the same team. Communication is key. Equal participants in deciding. So all that IEP team is equal in deciding students' needs, the services, and the outcome. Where do you want your child to be? Where should they be? Where does that teacher want your child to be? An opportunity to resolve differences and come to a mutual agreement. And this meeting determines a written commitment. The IEP is a legal document that indicates the resources and the special education services and goals that are going to be completed to be able to meet your child's needs. I said earlier that I share a funny picture. I kind of like this because we all base our behavior on the environment that we're in. So I obviously, act a little bit different if I'm at home versus if I'm at work. And if you're a parent, you know this already. So, at home, you might get the child on the left, and then they go to school and they get the child on the right. Or if it's an area that's difficult for them, at home, you might have the child on the right, and at school, you might have the child on the left because they're being able to they're asked to do things they're not able to do. So I just think this is important to remember. It's not anything that no one's passing judgment. Like at school, we see this problem. At home, you might not, and that's okay. But in order to meet what they need at school, we need to focus on what we're seeing in the school. So I just think that's something important for us all to remember. Parent participation. So meetings are scheduled at an agreed upon time. Remember that 10-day notice. If you're not able to attend, there is some flexibility. So alternative means of participation, video conferences, individual or conference telephone calls. We can extend based on certain circumstances. The state does not like for that to happen because we obviously everyone wants students to get what they need. A school may conduct an IEP team meeting without the parents in attendance at the school, despite repeated attempts has been unable to contact the parents. So that's why your participation is so important. And again, they only do that as a last resort, but that is something that they can do if they've attempted to reach you in multiple ways, multiple times, and they have records or documentation of that. So I think that's important for you to know. There's a lot of different IEP team considerations that go into the IEP. We kind of talked about those in the different components, but these are a little bit more specific based on special education. Components of the IEP, it all starts where your child is. So where are they performing? They're going to write goals based on that. You're going to measure and they're going to report that data to you. So again, if they're not giving you data or you're having difficulty understanding the data, ask questions. All students have to participate in state assessments. It might look a little bit different depending on the student. They're going to talk to you about secondary transition at a certain age of majority. So all students at the age of 18 become their own legal advocate unless you have paperwork put in place to change that. So that's something that the school district required, and we'll have conversations with you no later than the age of 17. Statement of special education related services, making sure that we are doing that least restrictive environment. Again, all this is based on the data. Present levels, so areas of concern, present level of academic performance in those areas. What's the degree? So where are typical children at that age or grade level? In the instructional environment, what are the strengths of the child? Measurable annual goals, I made sure to include in this. The school district's required to have a time frame, a condition, a behavior, and a criteria or criterion. So I explained just some examples of what that might look like. So you can look at this ahead of time at the IEP meeting. So you are able to participate in the conversations about time frame, conditions, behavior, and criteria. So time frame, the data completion, how will progress be measured, the performance being monitored or action, what do we want to see or not see, how much, how often, to determine that that goal is met. Why is it important to measure progress in annual goals? I think I already touched on that, but this is specific for what the school is required to give you based on Kansas state law and regulations. State assessments, like I said, every child's required to take the state assessment, but it might just look different. So that will be a conversation at the IEP meeting, and it has to be. So you'll be part of that conversation. Secondary transition. So if you're watching this and you have an older child, or you're getting to the point where the child is close to the age of 14, you're going to start talking about that. What skills do they need to be able to be successful in high school? Because we all know that high school is really important for all students, but especially students with disabilities. What services are they going to provide? How are they going to assess that? Goals, that's all individualized. So on this slide, what I included was just the different components and what those might look like. So you know those basics, that background information, so you're able to participate in a discussion. Age of majority, I already hit on this. So beginning at age 17, they're going to talk to you about that. Statement of special education. So it must include the exceptionality. So what did they qualify under? Was it autism, other health impairment? What services? Is it just educational services in the classroom or special education classroom, or is it speech, those related services? What aids and services do they need? Do they need an iPad to communicate? Do they need special pencils? Do they need, if you have a hearing impaired student, do they need specific hearing impaired electronics or classroom things for your child to be able to assess the curriculum? And then what does the school personnel need to be able to meet your individualized child's needs? Least restrictive environment. So earlier I said that that's one of the laws that we have to make sure that the school district is meeting. So is your child in general education classes without supports? Hopefully. Are they in a general education classroom? So they're included, or inclusion. Do they have special supports within that classroom that they can still stay with their peers? They just need a little extra help. Are they in the resource room? So are they pulled out of their regular education to meet with the resource teacher? There can be self-containment. Students are taught by special education teachers without other special education teachers. So it's just that one-on-one, right? So you might have small group for the self-contained, or you might have where they just work with your student without any other identified students. Separate schools. So for example, in 259, we have some separate schools dependent on the disability. And then residential. So do they need residential services like we provide here at Heartspring? But as an IEP team, we are required, you too, to have discussions on where their needs lie compared to the environment. So we have to identify that. Just to summarize this slide, the IEP has to be revised or looked at every year, so every 12 months. It can be looked at sooner. You can request that. The school district can request that. So if we have intervention A, B, and C that we're doing, but the data doesn't change, then we should not wait a whole year to make changes, right? So if you're 3 months into the IEP and the intervention's not working or the student's not responding, your child's not responding, we can revise that. So we can amend the IEP. It's called an IEP amendment. So we can make changes without an IEP meeting if you agree, only if you agree. And the school also has to provide you that prior written notice. So what are we changing? How are we changing, et cetera? So you can request by a parent or school staff for an IEP meeting at any time. Again, going back, those services have to be initiated within 10 school days, 60-day timeline, parent consent always. This is important once an IEP has been completed. Okay, so what this slide is indicating is make sure that this is communicated with all of the classroom teachers. So if you're an educator, I think that maybe this is the area where some schools struggle, and it's not, I'm not being negative or, really targeting that, but you have this IEP meeting, you get all this information. If all the teachers, so if your child is a middle school student, if those other teachers don't know that either your student's identified or your child's identified or the accommodations and modifications that they need, that's not good. So make sure that that's discussed at the meeting. I think that's probably the most helpful. How's that information going to get to other teachers? And then that information should also be relayed in the progress monitoring. So if they are receiving services in the general education classroom through special education, how are those two teachers working together to make sure that the child's needs are being met? So all teachers should know his or her specific responsibilities related to implementing the child's IEP. And the specific accommodations, modifications, and support. So for example, if your child, this is just an easy example for me, if your child needs an iPad to communicate, then that special education teacher or regular education teacher, it's mostly the regular education or specials teacher, needs to know that they need that iPad. So if your child comes to PE or music without the iPad, they're not going to be able to communicate, right? So that teacher has to have that information. And it doesn't just have to be communication. So if we're modifying curriculum or making accommodations, those accommodations and modifications happen in the general education classroom too. So if they don't know about it, they don't occur. So just make sure that there's a consistent plan for that communication. These are the ways that special education services can be discontinued. So you've already went through the process, they've been receiving those services. So it might become a point in time where they're no longer eligible. And that's a good thing. So they no longer need they no longer qualify under the second prong, they don't need those services, or they're no longer eligible. So most of the time it's that prong 2. So we've given them the supports that they need, they've responded to that intervention and they no longer need service. Graduation. So the IEP ends at graduation. Student reaches the end of the school year in which they turn 21. At any time, you revoke consent. So I don't want my child to do this anymore. You can revoke that anytime, but it has to be in writing. So you would write to the school, I no longer want my child to receive special education services. Student drops out of school, they must provide you a summary of performance. If your student graduates or the student reaches the end of the school year, provide the child with a summary of the child's academic achievement, functional performance, and any recommendations on how to assist the child in meeting the post-secondary goals. And then prior written notice or request for consent. So those are the ways that special education can be discontinued. Resolving disputes. So remember, I had that triangle. Most of the time we can feel comfortable and can meet that child's needs at that bottom level, the communication, relationships, IEP meetings, right? There are special circumstances in which that's not effective or it doesn't work. There's 3 different options, right? According to the state law. Mediation, but both parties must agree, either the parents or school can request, no cost to the parent or state. Formal complaint. So you've either mediated and that didn't work and it bumps up to a formal complaint, or both parties agree that mediation isn't going to be effective. Formal complaint, if you as a parent are at an impasse with the school district, you're right under federal or state regulations, and it must have occurred within the last year. You request in writing and you sign the formal complaint. And then the last one, as a last resort, is the due process hearing. So it seeks to ensure fairness and educational decisions and accountability only as a last result. The cost of the initial hearing must be provided for and paid by the school district, except for attorney fees, which you would know more information about that if you get to that point. So my advice to kind of wrap this up, ask questions. Please ask questions. As adults, I think we struggle, myself included, to feel safe to ask questions because sometimes we think we should already know, or we feel like we just aren't comfortable to ask questions. But I think a lot of the confusion, difficulty in relationship building, and this goes for everyone, is because we have difficulty asking questions because we feel like, hey, I'm going to ask this question, but it's, I know it's a stupid question. There are no stupid questions, right? Probably have heard that or said that to somebody. Educate yourself, know the processes. That was my main goal for today. So hopefully with this Zoom and having this information to be able to refer back to, a little bit more about the specific processes. Have it written down somewhere. So the IEP has a notes section. Make sure that, you'll get a copy of the notes. People are taking notes at the IEP meeting or the eligibility meeting. Familiarize with the Kansas Special Education Process Handbook. You as parents get your procedural safe practices and procedures. Review that information. There's a lot of information in there. Ask questions. Join an advocacy group. So remember, we didn't get where we are without parents like you advocating for at the state level for what their child needs. Challenge and push the Kansas State Department of Education or any state department of education. We have a pretty good, special education program statewide at the federal level, but we can always get better. Resources. So what I have done is, I just told you my advice for you is to look at the Kansas State Department of Education. I've included that website, which is included here. And if you click on this link or copy and paste this link, it's going to take you to the guide for special education and other legal information. It's going to include information about how to and what services and supports the Disability Rights Center of Kansas provides, what Families Together provides. Infinitech is like software and support. They have a really good website and resources for parents. Kansas Parent Information and Resource Center, Special Olympics of Kansas, and then the Kansas Technical Assistance System Network, or TASN. So the state of Kansas has a great program and great professionals to be able to help school districts with children who are struggling. And so that's always a resource that you can have. And it's, in my opinion, a really good resource. But here's how you get to all that information. So I want to make sure I provided that. Okay, I have to plug it one more time. Show me the data. All of this is dependent on the data. So, make sure that you have the data. Make sure that you ask questions about the data. Make sure that you understand the data. So again, I hope that I've given you relevant information. I hope I've empowered you. I hope that you understand more about the process. I hope that you understand and can demonstrate and know that all students benefit from your involvement in their education, right? Not just special education, but at the general education level as well. your role is active. It can be as active as you want it to be, but the IEP team is dependent on your active role, right? We can't have an IEP team without the parent. And then your rights as parents of students with or without identified disability. You know, you have rights. Seek out if you have questions about those rights or if you need more information. Knowledge is power. Again, without that knowledge, more than likely you're going to struggle to understand the information, just like everyone else. Like I said earlier, special education is difficult to understand. There's so many components. It's difficult for practitioners. It's difficult for attorneys. It's just difficult. So knowledge is power. Know the information. And that's it. I hope that this has been helpful. And I look forward to maybe doing future trainings to make sure that you have all the information that you need to be able to make sure that your child is successful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. Okay, if you guys have any questions, you can email care@heartspring.org and we'll be happy to help you out. Again, thank you, Megan, and we hope that this training was beneficial for you and your family.